Carthage. It's a name that rings out in history. For centuries, the focal point of the Mediterranean. Most successful by far of all the Phoenician cities, and according to many, founder of Europe's first empire. Yet, the story of Carthage is a tragic one, almost always framed by its total defeat by Rome in the Punic Wars. Vicious world conflicts fought for dominion over the waterways of the Mediterranean. Massive sea battles numbering tens of thousands on each side, numbers that arguably wouldn't be surpassed until modern naval warfare, nearly 2,000 years later. For Carthage, a defeat so complete and brutal that this once mighty confederation was not only silenced forever, but its once verdant fields salted, its population killed or sold into slavery. The city would rise again, but never as an independent power, peopled now by a different culture. Today, the city and the vast empire it once held lives on only in archaeology and the writings of its enemies. "500 years before the first confrontation between the two maritime powers, when Rome was still a tiny village on the Palatine Hill, Phoenician traders sailed their ships the length and breadth of the Mediterranean in search of goods to be sold or traded for a handsome profit. Of course, there were great risks in making such a long sea voyage, but the enormous profit that could be made the risks worthwhile. The key was to trade a product that was unique, very desirable, hard to get, or desperately needed, for other products that were common in the land of the people with whom you were trading. These products may be rare and desirable somewhere else, and the trader now had something with which he could once again make a profit. Though no doubt some plied the sea roads during the Bronze Age, by the beginning of the Iron Age, ship technology was at a level that the entire sea could be traversed in a matter of weeks. Before this time, ancient sailors didn't usually sail out of the sight of land, or at night, but these concerns meant little to the Phoenicians. Using the stars, landmarks, and eventually nautical instruments, they navigated the sea, making port all along its shores, ultimately leaving their mark on the disparate peoples they came upon. Far from an isolating experience, by the 800s, every 30 miles or so a colony seems to have sprung up. Way stations for ambitious merchants to make their fortune. Many cities we know today had their roots with the Phoenicians. Notably, Cadiz in Spain was a large, well-established mercantile centre. It's even thought these newcomers began to influence the various Celtic and Iberian peoples of the peninsula. On the islands of the sea, Sardinia, Corsica, and Sicily, widespread colonisation took place, not just commercial activity. And in all likelihood, as shreds of evidence on Sardinia such as the Norah Stone suggests, wars were fought between independent leaders and incoming merchant powers, perhaps supported by swords for hire, as Carthage later was. Wars left almost completely unrecorded in any surviving histories. Though initially the colonization of the Mediterranean may have been motivated by the prospect of commercial gain, today some scholars have argued that years of reduced rainfall and drought may have also been a factor. This environmental catastrophe would have resulted in plummeting crop yields for Phoenicia's ever-expanding population. With little territory of their own outside of their cities, the Phoenicians' only option may have been to take to the seas in search of a better life. Resulting in a permanent Phoenician population in the Mediterranean. Due to its proximity to their homeland, the first area believed to have been colonized by Phoenician traders, perhaps as early as the 11th century BC, was the nearby island of Cyprus. A land replete with valuable minerals and metals such as copper. The largest Phoenician community here was based at Kition, which began as a small trading outpost, but eventually grew into a prosperous, cosmopolitan city that after some time even contained a large Greek population. Evidence of other Phoenician settlements has been found on the nearby islands of Rhodes, Thera, Crete, Thasos, and Milos. Along with those of the Aegean, the Phoenicians established a sizable presence in what is today Italy. Before long, though, they had to compete here with Greek colonists. For example, in Sicily, the historian Thucydides states that Phoenician colonists had originally established themselves all over the island to conduct trade with its native inhabitants. The arrival of Greek colonists, however, forced them to abandon most of these settlements and to constrain their activities to the northwest, notably at Motia, Solunto, and Palermo. This was also a much safer area for them due to its proximity to the Phoenician settlements in North Africa. Archaeological findings at Motia have confirmed Thucydides' account of a Phoenician settlement there shortly after the establishment of early Greek colonies such as Naxos and Syracuse in the early 730s BC. As we have seen, though, the furthest Phoenician colonies were in what is today Spain, and just possibly further to the north in what is now France and Britain, though evidence of these is yet to be found. Here, the Phoenicians conducted trade with the locals, offering items such as glass, oil, and ceramics in return for silver and tin. But this wasn't the only place Phoenician explorers visited. At least one inscription talks of a voyage south from the Pillars of Hercules. In the 5th or 6th centuries BC, under a merchant captain named Hanno the Navigator. Going all the way down the coast of Africa to the south of the Sahara. They even apparently made landfall before returning. Indeed, it is in Africa the most visible remnants of these people can be seen. The most famous and powerful of all Phoenician colonies being situated along the north coast. Here, the two most prominent were Utica, founded by colonists from Sidon, and of course, Carthage. in myth, founded by the legendary Queen Dido following the Trojan War, in reality thought to have been colonized from Tyre. Due to good farmland and perhaps fewer native inhabitants, these colonies overall prospered earlier than many of their peers, which may have motivated their inhabitants to create more permanent settlements and cities rather than temporary trading posts. In time, many of these cities would become the nucleus for larger states, and eventually, at least in the case of Carthage, the establishment of new colonies of its own, ultimately leading to an empire that not only rivaled Rome for supremacy in the Mediterranean, but ultimately taught Rome much about war, empire, and society. The Romans essentially absorbing the Carthaginian state, along with much of its infrastructure, commercial ties, and military strategies. During the latter part of the 20th century, the discovery and excavation of such settlements and colonies has greatly aided our understanding of Phoenician life and material culture. Though many Phoenician inscriptions have been uncovered throughout the Mediterranean world and the Near East, especially stone tablets, sarcophagi, and ornate metal utensils, other than the names of kings or dedications to various deities, few contain any significant details in regards to history. While there are several references in Greek and Roman sources to the works of Phoenician authors, perhaps most notably the early Christian bishop Eusebius, who talks of a whole range of Phoenician books, unfortunately, copies of these works have yet to be uncovered. In order to have been preserved, they would have needed to have been copied from the leather or papyrus they were written on at some point in the past. This copying by Roman or medieval researchers is what saved the ancient Greek writings from oblivion. Phoenicians, however, largely disappearing as a cultural group, had no spiritual successors and no such luck. In 332 BC, after spilling over the borders of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, last of the great Near Eastern empires of the ancient world, a massive army arrived in Phoenicia. After centuries of commercial competition, out on the wide open sea, the Greeks had come to the Phoenician homeland. For this was the invasion force of Alexander the Great, king of the far-off mountain kingdom of Macedon. Byblos and Sidon soon submitted, and according to Alexander's chronicler Arrian, he'd wanted to take the city of Tyre peacefully too, seeking to make a symbolic sacrifice at the city's temples. Phoenicia never had a single capital, but Tyre, jewel of the coast, came closest. Ringed by immense sea and land walls, home to 30,000 people at its height. Proudly defiant and knowing the effects such a concession would have on their authority, the priests of the city resolutely refused the young Macedonian king. Alexander ordered a siege, one of the most hard-fought of the entire war. 7 months later, during which time a massive causeway had been built from the mainland to the heart of the city, situated on an island, Alexander's troops finally got in, killing thousands of its inhabitants. In total, according to the Greek sources, 30,000 of the surviving Tyrians and some unfortunate Carthaginians were sold into slavery. After which, instead of honouring the Phoenician gods, Alexander made a sacrifice to Hercules, holding a procession in his honour. Some citizens of Tyre had fled to Carthage during the siege, which would survive as the last bastion of Phoenician culture for another century, until conquest by another Greek-influenced state, Rome. The rest of Phoenicia soon surrendered. By Alexander's time, much had changed since the golden age of Phoenicia between the years 1000 and 800 BC, talked of at inscriptions at Byblos and Tyre. But how and why did that golden age come to an end? Well, whilst the Greeks had few enemies to contend with in their homelands, besides other Greeks, often free to conduct their overseas activities with little stopping them, the Phoenicians had to deal with vast empires on their doorstep. Empires which collapsed in the Bronze Age, allowing the Phoenicians to flourish. But soon, those old empires would re-emerge with the new Age of Iron. As we have seen, most of our post-Bronze Age sources on the Phoenicians come from the texts of others, the earliest being those of the Assyrians. Inscriptions of the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled between 1114 and 1076 BC, claims to have visited the area around the Phoenician city of Arwad, bringing back with him to Assyria the region's prized cedar trees. Egyptian texts, as well as the Hebrew Bible, also mention Phoenician cedarwood being an item of great value. This, though, was just the beginning. Around 870 BC, the Assyrian king Ashurnasirpal II also mentions several military campaigns in the area, and by the reign of his son Shalmaneser III, the Assyrian presence in Phoenicia had become more or less permanent. Though there were frequent rebellions. For example, several cities such as Byblos and Arwad formed anti-Assyrian coalitions with their non-Phoenician neighbours. Things in Phoenicia cooled after Shalmaneser's death, mostly due to internal problems within the Assyrian Empire itself. However, new Assyrian incursions into the region came with the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III in the 740s BC. And by the reign of Sennacherib 4 decades later, fear had compelled most of the Phoenician kings to submit to Assyrian rule. By then, Assyria was clearly calling the shots in the eastern Mediterranean. Eventually extending its control over the island of Cyprus too. However, foreign domination of the region didn't necessarily mean that local rulers couldn't personally benefit from the new political order. Becoming an ally or vassal of Assyria offered rulers and their kingdoms various protections against their local rivals. For example, during the reign of Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, the Phoenician city of Tyre became a vassal of Assyria. Its king, Baal, was able to swear unquestioned loyalty to Esarhaddon, and of course provide tribute and military aid. In this case, the use of Tyre's navy whenever called upon. In return, though, Baal was given extensive control over several other port cities, including Byblos, Akko, and Dor. This unquestionably made him the most powerful Phoenician ruler of his time. A client king of the Assyrians, like Herod with the Romans, perhaps. Despite this, Baal eventually did revolt against Esarhaddon, though Tyre was forced to resubmit to Assyrian rule shortly afterward. Another king, Abdi Milkuti of Sidon, rose up against Assyrian rule during this period of civil war, allying with another prince named Sandawari, the king of Kundi and Sizu. Although the two were ultimately defeated, and after attempting to flee into the sea, were, according to the Assyrians, plucked out of the waters by Esarhaddon, decapitated and paraded through the streets of Nineveh. When the Assyrian Empire finally fell by around 615 BC, many of the kingdoms of the Levant, including those of Phoenicia, were able to rule themselves independently for a time, until the rise of the next empire. One which inherited much of the infrastructure left behind by Assyria, that of the Neo-Babylonians, which in 585 BC, under the king Nebuchadnezzar, easily began conquering much of the region, with the exception of Tyre, which held out for over a decade until it too was finally forced to submit, though on relatively favourable terms. By around 540 BC, the final, vast Near Eastern empire of the ancient world, that of the Persian Achaemenids under Cyrus the Great, acquired Phoenicia as one of its many possessions. For the most part, the Persians allowed the Phoenicians to run their own day-to-day affairs as they wished, as long as they paid their taxes and allowed the Persian forces to make use of their extensive navies, which they did on several occasions, including during their massive invasion of Greece in 480 BC. The exception to this was during the reign of Cyrus's son, Cambyses II. According to Herodotus, Cambyses wanted to launch a campaign against the Carthaginians, but the Phoenicians, especially the sailors from Tyre, refused, due mostly to the fact that their ancestors had been amongst the founders of Carthage, and links between the two cities remained strong. It's also during the years of Persian rule, as well as afterward, that many Greek writers and historians took an especially keen interest in the Phoenicians. Though Homer mentions them in the Iliad, Herodotus is the first major writer to extensively comment on them and give substantial details about their culture and customs, also crediting them for introducing the alphabetic script to the Greek-speaking world. In his monumental work, The Histories, he writes the following.
So these Phoenicians, including the Gephraians, came with Cadmos and settled this land. And they transmitted much lore to the Hellenes, and in particular taught them the alphabet, which I believe the Hellenes did not have previously, but which was originally used by all Phoenicians. With the passage of time, both the sound and the shape of the letters changed, because at this time it was mostly Ionians who lived around the Phoenicians. They were the ones who were first instructed in the use of the alphabet by them. And after making a few changes to the form of the letters, they put them to good use, but when they spoke of them, they called them Phoenician letters, which was only right, since these letters had been introduced to Hellas by Phoenicians.
In reality, the Phoenicians may not have actually invented the alphabet, which scholars now believe may have been developed by other Canaanite peoples in Egypt or the Levant, sometime during the Middle or Late Bronze Age. There also being a related script from South Arabia, probably born through mercantile connections. However, it seems that the Phoenicians were among the first peoples to both utilise and spread the use of alphabetic writing throughout the Mediterranean and beyond. In 343 BC, the cities of Tyre and Arwad revolted against the Persian king Artaxerxes III. But this rebellion was soon crushed. Other than this though, Phoenicia remained relatively calm and stable during its nearly 2 centuries of Persian rule. Until, in 332, Alexander of Macedon came to the Levant. Alexander's arrival and subsequent conquest of Phoenicia marked the beginning of the gradual Hellenization of the region. After his death in 323, Phoenicia was hotly contested amongst his successors. But eventually the region found itself within the confines of the Greek Seleucid Empire, ruled by one of Alexander's generals. Gradually, Greek language, culture, architecture, and religion began to permeate every aspect of Phoenician life. The age of the Phoenicians was over. The Hellenistic age had begun. In neighbouring Judea, the culture of the Jews survived, albeit with a Hellenistic influence. In Phoenicia, however, it wasn't to be the case. Merging with the peoples they came into contact with, their culture gradually disappearing. In some respects, however, all peoples of the Mediterranean Sea are Phoenicians. Despite the new world that was forming around them, one aspect of the Phoenicians that changed little was their mastery over the sea. Especially when it came to maritime commerce. Their ships continued to traverse the Mediterranean in order to find new and lucrative trade opportunities. And probably due to this, Phoenician cities remained extremely prosperous, continuing until about 62 BC, when the Romans took over, and Phoenicia was incorporated into the Roman province of Syria. By this time, however, many of the characteristics that had once made the Phoenicians a distinct people had almost vanished, as did references to them in literature and records of the time. As we have seen, however, the legacy of the Phoenicians is still with us today. Thanks for watching.